The interior of the C-17 transport plane was a metallic cavern, a steel womb lit by a sinister red light that painted the young, anxious faces of Jacob Barnes and his brothers-in-arms in hues of blood and foreboding. They sat on web seats that lined the fuselage walls, knee to knee, a compact mass of humanity and firepower, each man a universe of silent thoughts. Jake held his M4 rifle between his knees, the cold metal a familiar, comforting presence in a moment of profound strangeness. He looked at the faces of Diaz and Tex beside him. Diaz's bravado was gone, replaced by a tense stillness, his eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead. Tex seemed to have withdrawn into himself, his farmer's face an impassive mask. The air in the cabin was heavy with the smell of jet fuel, sweat, and the subtle odor of fear. Then came the sound that marked the true point of no return, the hydraulic groan of the rear ramp beginning to close. It was a slow, inexorable sound, the sound of a vault door being locked. The bright Georgia morning sun was slowly consumed, reduced to a sliver, then a line, and then to total darkness, leaving them with only the red interior lighting. In that moment of sudden blackness, the outside world ceased to exist. There was no more Clayton, Ohio. There was no more America. There was only this metal box, suspended between heaven and earth, carrying them toward their destiny. Jake felt a knot in his stomach, a sense of finality so absolute it was nearly suffocating. The choice had been made. The path was set. He was on his way to the war. The C-17's 4 jet engines spooled up, the sound growing from a hum to a roar that vibrated through the metal deck, up through the soles of Jake's boots, climbing his legs and lodging in his chest. The plane began to move slowly at first, then gaining speed with an urgency that seemed to belie its massive size. Jake felt himself pressed back into the web seat, the force of the acceleration an invisible, giant hand pushing him down. He gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. Through a small circular window in the fuselage, he watched the familiar world of the military base become a green and gray blur. And then, with a surprising smoothness, the rumbling of the runway vanished, replaced by a feeling of weightlessness. They were airborne. The plane climbed at a steep angle, the roar of the engines filling the universe. Jake leaned over, pressing his face against the cold acrylic of the window. He saw Georgia unfold beneath him, the pine forests becoming a green carpet, the rivers snaking like silver veins. Soon, the clouds swallowed them, and all that was left was a white, featureless void. He was rising, leaving behind not just his home, but the earth itself, ascending into an aerial purgatory at 30,000 feet. The sensation was profoundly disorienting. He was a boy from a Rust Belt town, whose longest trip had been for a football game in another state. Now, he was being hurled across the sky, on his way to a place he only knew from maps and news reports. The ascent was not just physical, it was metaphysical. He was leaving the world of the living, the world of normalcy, and rising to a different plane of existence, one where the rules of life and death were tragically fluid. The hours that followed were an exercise in suspended monotony, a long, droning transit across the Atlantic inside a loud metal tube. The constant roar of the engines became the background noise of their new existence, a sound so omnipresent that after a while they ceased to hear it. Most of the soldiers tried to sleep, contorting their bodies into awkward positions on the web seats, using their rucksacks as pillows, seeking a brief oblivion from the future that awaited them. But sleep was a fleeting relief, interrupted by turbulence or their own internal demons. Jake couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, replaying his training, his parents' faces, Carver's words. He watched the others, in the red gloom. He saw the diversity of America there, faces of every color and background, now united by a single purpose and a shared fear. At one point, he saw Diaz, who was sitting across the aisle, shivering slightly in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of the New York cold or the desert fear. Without thinking, Jake reached over and pulled the edge of a military blanket over Diaz's shoulder. It was a small, almost unnoticeable gesture. But Tex, sitting next to Jake, saw it. He said nothing, just gave Jake a brief, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. In that silent gesture, Jake felt the depth of what they had become. They were no longer just members of a fire team, they were each other's keepers. In that limbo between home and the war, amidst the roar of the engines, they were forging their own form of peace, a peace based on the quiet certainty that they were not alone in their fall. Somewhere over the ocean, Jake took a small notebook and a pen from his pocket. He felt a sudden, overwhelming need to write to his parents, to try and build a bridge of words across the gulf of experience that now separated them. He started the letter with the usual greeting, "Dear Mom and Dad," and then he stopped. What could he possibly say? How could he describe the feeling of the ramp closing, the sense of finality, without terrifying them? How could he explain the strange calm that had settled over him, an acceptance that could be easily mistaken for indifference? He tried to write about the training, about the camaraderie, but the words felt like cliches lifted from bad war movies. The truth of his experience, the dehumanization, the pain, the rewiring of his soul, was untranslatable. To write "I'm okay" would be a lie. To write "I'm scared" would be a cruelty. He realized that the language of the world he had left behind was no longer adequate to describe the world he now inhabited. He stared at the blank page, at the two opening words, and felt like a man trying to describe the color red to someone born blind. The experience was total, visceral, and words were woefully inadequate tools to capture it. After several minutes of silent agony, he closed the notebook. The letter would remain unwritten, a silent testament to the uncrossable distance. Communication, he was learning, was one of the first casualties of war. The refueling stop at Ramstein airbase in Germany was an experience in cultural surrealism. After hours in the dark, roaring limbo of the C-17, they disembarked into a piece of America, transplanted into the heart of Europe. The base was an oasis of order and cleanliness, with manicured streets, trimmed lawns, and architecture that could have been lifted from any Ohio suburb. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the Georgia humidity. They were herded into a large terminal that felt more like a shopping mall than a military installation. There was a Burger King, a Pizza Hut, a store that sold electronics and American magazines. Jake sat with his fire team at a bright plastic table, eating a Whopper that tasted sinfully familiar. The juxtaposition was nauseating. A few hours ago, he had been mentally preparing for war. Now he was listening to the sound of a milkshake being made and the chatter of military families discussing their weekend plans. It was a bizarre reminder of the world they were supposedly going to fight to protect, a world of comfort and normalcy that now seemed strangely fragile and artificial. The experience wasn't comforting, it was disorienting. That oasis of normality only accentuated the abnormality of their mission. They were ghosts at the feast, men marked by a purpose that separated them from everyone around them. They ate in silence, refueling their bodies, but the brief stop only deepened their sense of isolation. The second leg of the journey from Ramstein to Iraq was a journey into darkness, both literally and figuratively. The atmosphere on the C-17 had fundamentally changed. The restless exhaustion of the first leg was replaced by a tense, focused quiet. The jokes stopped. The books and magazines were put away. The men were now engaged in silent rituals of preparation. They checked their gear over and over, their movements methodical and precise. Jake watched as Tex field stripped and reassembled the bolt of his saw machine gun, his thick fingers moving with the delicacy of a watchmaker. Diaz, normally a fountain of nervous energy, sat, silently with his eyes closed, perhaps praying, perhaps just centering his mind. Jake felt the shift in himself as well. He took out his grandfather's compass from his pocket, feeling the cool, reassuring weight in his hand. He didn't open it, he just held it. It was a tangible connection to a world that was about to become very distant. The plane flew in total darkness, no navigation lights, to avoid being a target. Outside, the world was an inky abyss. Inside, the red cabin light seemed more sinister, the air thinner. They were entering the theater of operations. The simulation was over. Every man on the aircraft, from the pilot to the youngest private, was now focused with a singularity of purpose. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by the certainty of arrival. They were on their way to work. The pilot's announcement came over the loudspeakers, his voice calm and professional, but the words sent a surge of adrenaline through the cabin. "Gentlemen, we will begin our descent into Ul. Acid in 5 minutes. Expect a tactical approach. Remain seated and be prepared." Tactical approach. The phrase was a euphemism for a maneuver designed to save their lives, but that felt like a ride on a roller coaster from hell. The sound of the engines changed, and the plane began to descend not in a gentle slope, but in a series of tight, dizzying spirals, a maneuver known as the corkscrew. Jake felt his stomach rise into his throat, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. He looked out the small window and saw the dark desert spinning below, a disorienting landscape of nothingness. The maneuver was designed to present the most unpredictable target possible to enemy fire from the ground. For the men inside, it was a visceral, immediate reminder that they were entering a place where the very act of landing was a mortal risk. The fear in the cabin was palpable, a metallic scent in the recycled air. Knuckles were white where men gripped their weapons and their seats. Jake closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, just as the marksmanship instructors had taught him. In, out, control. The spiral seemed to last an eternity. Then, with a jolt that shook the entire aircraft, the wheels touched down. They had arrived. The sound of the C-17's rear ramp unlatching was like the click of a prison lock being opened. A hydraulic groan echoed through the metal cavern, and a line of blinding light appeared at the base of the ramp, growing as the door descended. The light was so white and intense it hurt Jake's eyes, which were accustomed to the red gloom of the cabin. And then came the wall of heat. It was not the humid heat of Georgia. It was a dry, searing heat that felt like it came from an oven. It had a weight of its own, a physical presence that hit him in the chest. And with the heat came the smell. It was an olfactory symphony that instantly overwhelmed his senses. The pungent scent of jet fuel, the fine, ancient dust of the desert, which had an almost mineral odor, and underneath it all a strange, sweet and rancid smell he couldn't identify, but that his instincts told him was the smell of a place where life and death lived in uncomfortable proximity. The sound of the outside world rushed in, the roar of other engines, the distant shriek of sirens, the sound of voices shouting in a language he didn't understand. The contrast with the tense silence inside the plane was total. Jacob Barnes stood at the edge of the ramp, blinking against the light, feeling the heat on his face, inhaling the strange smells, listening to the cacophony of the base. He was at the gates of hell, and the reality was far more vivid and overwhelming than anything his training could have possibly simulated. The order came, screamed by a sergeant already waiting on the tarmac. "Disembark, move, move, move!" The inertia was broken, and the platoon began to move, a long line of olive drab shuffling down the ramp and into the blinding light. Jacob Barnes took the first step off the aircraft and felt the sole of his boot crunch on the tarmac gravel. The sound, small and insignificant, felt monumental in his mind. It was the sound of his arrival, the sound of his entry into the war. The ground beneath his feet was solid, real, and it was in a country 10,000 kilometers from his home. The heat instantly enveloped him, the sun beating down on his helmet, the hot, dusty air filling his lungs with every breath. He moved with the rest of his platoon, his eyes trying to take in everything at once. The vastness of the desert that stretched beyond the base, the horizon shimmering with heat, the massive scale of the base itself, a makeshift city of concrete, metal, and barbed wire. The sky, not the soft blue sky of Ohio, but a deep, unforgiving blue that seemed to have no end. Every sensory detail was being seared into his brain with a feverish clarity. He was overwhelmed, but his training took over. He maintained his spacing, held his rifle in the correct position, scanned the perimeter. He was functioning. He was a soldier on enemy soil, and the boy who had left Clayton, Ohio, with fear and hope, now seemed like a figure from a distant novel, a character with whom he no longer had any connection. As they were herded hurriedly across the tarmac, they passed another group of soldiers. These men were moving in the opposite direction, toward the same C-17 Jake had just disembarked from. They were going home. They were the veterans Jake's platoon was replacing. Jake looked at them, and what he saw shocked him. They didn't look like the soldiers from the recruitment posters. Their uniforms were sun-bleached and worn thin. Their faces were masks of an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have settled in their bones. And their eyes. Their eyes were the most frightening thing. They had what the old-timers called the 1,000-yard stare, a vacant, unfocused gaze that seemed to look right through Jake. At some distant point on the horizon only they could see. They didn't look happy to be going home. They just looked empty, used up. Some of them looked at Jake and the other newcomers, and on their faces was a mixture of pity and contempt. One older sergeant, his face like a wrinkled road map, spit on the ground near Jake's boots as he passed. "Fresh meat," he muttered. The words hit Jake with the force of a punch. In those men, in those tired, dirty ghosts, Jake saw himself in a year. He saw the price of survival. He saw what the war did to a man's soul. The image of those empty eyes would haunt him, a premonition of what he would have to become in order to one day board that same plane home. The chaos of the tarmac was quickly replaced by the familiarity of military order, but it was an order of a different kind, harsher, more urgent. A master sergeant, a woman with a face that looked like it was carved from granite and a voice that could cut steel, gathered them near a set of concrete barriers. "Welcome to Iraq, ladies," she screamed, her voice devoid of any warmth. "This is not the Louisiana playground. Here the enemy is real, the heat is real, and death is permanent. You know nothing. You are a liability. Your only job for the next few days is to listen, to obey, and to try not to get yourselves or your brothers killed through stupidity. Now grab your gear and get on the trucks." The brutality of her greeting was a shock, but also a relief. It was the language they understood. The uncertainty of the arrival was being replaced by the certainty of the hierarchy. They were shoved onto the back of a troop transport truck, a six-wheeled vehicle that smelled of diesel and old sweat. Jake squeezed in between Tex and Diaz, the metal of the truck already hot to the touch. The canvas cover over their heads did nothing to stop the heat. The brief sense of accomplishment for having arrived safely was completely erased, replaced by the understanding that they were at the bottom of the food chain. All over again, new guys in a dangerous world where a single mistake could be their last. The ride from the flight line to their temporary housing area was a tour through an alien city. Al-Assad airbase was not a base, it was a fortified metropolis, a scar of civilization in the middle of the desert. Jake peered out the back of the truck, trying to absorb the scale of it all. There were miles of T-shaped concrete barriers, known as Bremer walls, that lined every road, creating artificial canyons. There were massive aircraft hangars, field hospitals, dining facilities the size of gymnasiums, and endless rows of CHUs, containerized housing units, the metal boxes that would serve as their homes. Military vehicles of every shape and size moved in a constant flow, from Humvees to Abrams tanks, kicking up clouds of fine dust that coated everything in a beige film. It was an overwhelming display of American military might, a massive war machine operating 24/7. Yet, for all its strength and organization, there was a sense of impermanence to it all. The base felt like a siege camp, a temporary foothold in a hostile land. There was no beauty, no comfort, only the brutal functionality of survival. Jacob Barnes realized he hadn't arrived at a place to live. He had arrived at a launching platform, a place from which the war was projected, and he was the newest piece of ammunition to be loaded. The truck finally lurched to a halt in front of a row of metal shipping containers that were distinguishable from the others only by the number painted on their side. "Home sweet home, ladies," screamed the sergeant escorting them. "Enjoy the luxury." Jake and the others jumped down, the impact on their knees sending a jolt of pain through their tired bodies. He dragged his rucksack and his gear into his assigned container. The interior was a long, narrow metal box with metal bunk beds lined up on both sides. The air inside was stagnant and hot, and it had a distinct smell, a mixture of desert dust, the sweat of hundreds of men who had passed through before him, a faint odor of mildew, and the electrical smell of an air conditioning unit that was fighting a brave but losing battle against the heat. That, he realized, was the smell of his new home. He threw his gear onto an empty bunk, the only space in the universe that now belonged to him. The metal walls were covered in graffiti and the names of units that had long since departed. He was living in the history of other men sleeping in the bed of a ghost. The reality of his situation began to sink in, not as a wave, but as a slow, cold seepage into his bones. He was no longer in training. He was no longer on his way. He was here, in the middle of nowhere, in the heart of the war. After the chaos of the arrival, there was a brief moment of quiet. The sergeants left them to get settled, and an exhausted silence fell over the container. Jake sat on his bunk, the metal creaking under his weight. He could feel the hum of a generator through the floor, a constant vibration that was the heartbeat of the base. He was overwhelmed, his senses dulled by the heat, the dust, the fear, and the exhaustion. He reached into his pants pocket and his fingers found the cool, familiar shape of his grandfather's compass. He took it out, flipping open the metal lid. In the dim light of the container, the quivering needle settled, pointing steadfastly north. He stared at that needle. Amidst all this alien chaos, this overwhelming disorientation, here was something constant, something true. That needle didn't care about Iraq or the war, it just pointed home. Holding his grandfather's compass in that hot metal box thousands of miles from Ohio, Jacob Barnes felt a strange calm descend upon him. The fear didn't disappear, nor did the uncertainty, but underneath it all, he felt the foundation of his own resolve solidify. He was here, he had a job to do, and he had a compass to remind him of the way back. The journey was over, the war was about to begin.